So from the beginning of time, people have been wondering, and what happens when we die? What happens, and when is the end of the world going to come, right? So we've had predictions since the time of the biblical time, and probably before then. In 66 A.D., kind of time of the Jewish revolts against Rome, there was a man named Simon Bar Giora who prophesied that the end of the world would come between 66 and 70 A.D. And for a lot of the people in Israel, for the Jewish people in Israel, 70 A.D. did feel like the end, because that was the time when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. But it's been going on and on and on. Pope Sylvester II and many popes over the years have predicted when the end of the time would come. Pope Sylvester said that it would come on 1000 A.D. We know it didn't, right? Pope Innocent then changed it up, and it would come at 1284, which was 666 years after the rise of Islam. That's what they had thought back then. So 1284, we know it didn't happen then. Botticelli, the painter, even someone who's not a theologian or a church person, got into the act. And painter, he believed that the tribulation and that the millennium would begin 3.5 years from 1500, and that the end of time would come in 1504. Even Martin Luther in 1600 thought that the end of the world would come. Christopher Columbus, 1656, he predicted the end in his book of prophecies. The Shakers, which were a Christian denomination from England in the 18th century, they believed that the world will end in 1792. Chuck Smith, who went to the movie Jesus Revolution, right? So Chuck Smith, who was depicted there by Kelsey Grammer, Chuck Smith he made a prediction that in 1948 the world would come to an end, because it would be a generation after Israel became a state in 1948. But he also identified, I could be wrong about that. Pat Robertson several times has declared the end of the world, and in late 1976 he declared that 1982 would be the time, and then later it was April 29th, 2007. Hal Lindsey, the author of the late great Planet Earth, believed that Jesus would return within 40 years, a biblical generation after the Israeli statehood. So in 1988 he thought that would be ending. And Nostradamus had made a prediction that July of 1999, he said 1999 and 7 months. And so we made it by July. And then, of course, Y2K. You guys remember Y2K? Yeah. Many have predicted the end of the world and Y2K, and it didn't quite happen. And then, not long ago, 2012, we had the time of the Mayan calendar. Remember that? Lead up till December, and didn't quite happen. So it's been something that's been of fascination to people for years and years and years. And good people and deeply religious people and even non-religious people have wondered and have researched and put forth theories and debated, what does the end of time look like? Today's bumper sticker, in case of rapture, this car will be empty. There are no, I didn't see on the internet, there were no that said empty, so unmanned. Okay, we'll give them a pass, right, ladies? Okay. In case of rapture, this car will be empty, and you may or may not have seen these around, but this idea of the rapture, and we're going to get into some of the details here shortly, that the car, you would just kind of disappear, and the car would be on its own. There's a youth director joke in churches with a lot of youth. The youth director is always one of the targets by the rest of the staff usually, and there's an old joke that they were in a staff meeting and the youth director nodded off a little bit. And so everybody in the staff meeting or at the church got up very quietly, and they got some clothes from the clothes closet, and they put it around the chairs where they had been sitting. And they snuck out of the room. And then somebody clashed some cymbals together from down the hall, and the youth director suddenly woke up, and he saw everybody gone and these clothes sitting and he thought that maybe he had been left behind. The disciples wanted to know. In the scripture that Cody read, the disciples wanted to know, when is the date? When is the time? How is it going to happen? Paul later in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 was answering the same question for the people of the church of Thessalonica. They wanted to know, and they wanted to be living their lives correctly. And many thought then that the end was very near, so they just kind of said, let's eat, drink, and be merry, because the end is near. But Paul told them something else. And then later on, John, right in the book of Revelation, where much of this information comes from, in Revelation 20, John gives some details of his dream, his vision from God that he was instructed to write down. And it gives us a little glimpse of what might happen. But honest and sincere Christians have debated and theorized this topic since the very time of Jesus. And I don't think we will probably know the real answer to this till we see Jesus face to face. And we'll find out if we're on the right track or not. My guess is often Jesus will go, you guys made this a lot more difficult than this had to be. It's kind of I think that's going to be one of Jesus' standard answers for us, probably. So this is going to be a little bit academic today. I'm going to try to make it interesting, but first I just want to define some terms so we kind of all are on a similar page. So the first term is a big SAT seminary word called eschatology, but it's really simple. Anytime you see ology on the end, our English teacher means the study of, right? The study of the end time. Well, the answer was up there too, right? So this is the study. Eschaton means the end times, the study of the end times. Rapture. Rapture is the moments when it's believed that believers will be taken up, will be caught up and taken into heaven. And we're going to look at some different theories here in a minute of how that might transpire. Then we have the millennium. The millennium is a period of time when Christ will reign on earth. And you're going to see in these different theories that some of them are a literal 1,000 years, and some are just might be a period of time, a long period of time. The second coming, we sort of kind of know this is the point in time when Jesus is going to come to earth for a second time. Jesus was born to the Virgin Mary. That was the first coming of Jesus, and there'll be another time when Jesus comes back again and to judge the living and the dead, like we say in our Apostles' Creed. And then that's what the final judgment is. That's that time when Jesus is going to come back for that second coming. Jesus is going to judge the living and the dead. And then the last one we have is tribulation, another word we hear often. And it's a period of time when the earth will experience great troubles. Some of these ideas think it's a literal period of time of 7 years. Others believe it's the Great Tribulation is named that because of not so much that of what's going to be happening, but of the great length of tribulation. So some believe it's just part of the church age as well, not necessarily a literal 7 years. So let's dig into a couple of these ideas and see what we can see. The first one, I need a couple of volunteers. Anybody want to volunteer? I need actually a bunch. I need about 8 of you to come up here and stand with me for a few minutes. Val, you want to come up? And Katie, Larry, come on down. All right, that's 3. I need some more. You don't have to know anything, believe me. You don't have to do anything. I'm not going to embarrass you too much. All right, Carol Ann's coming. Okay, good. All right, good. Just go ahead and stand up here 8 across if you would, please. That's perfect. Excellent. Thank you, Jim. Is that 8? Yeah, okay. Should we have them give their testimonies now? So our first theory is called amillennialism. And amillennialism is really the simplest theory of how the end of time will work. And it's going to work like this. So we're going to have a church age that is going to be happening along the same period of time, and that is the millennium. So Vicky and Sherry are kind of together, okay? And then also during this long period of time, so the church age starts right as Christ died and was resurrected. That's the beginning of the church age. So about AD 33 to now is what we call the church age. And so in this theory of amillennialism, it says that the church age is going to happen. That's also going to be the same time as the millennium. It's not a literal 1,000 years. It's just a long period of time. And during that time, we're going to have tribulation. So all three of these things are happening at the same time from the time of Christ all the way up till now, okay? And then at some points, we're going to have the return of Christ, okay? And at the return of Christ, we are going to have the rapture that will come, that believers, and actually we can give that to Val. This is all happening at the same time, so you guys get a little close together if you're happening at the same time. Nope, just those three. And then Val and Larry, you guys are happening at the same time. We're also going to end Katie in there, so at the same time that's happening, the resurrection of the dead, those faithful believers who have gone before us and will be rising up out of the grave, and they will be going to eternal life. And then with that comes the judgment of the world. So non-believers, believers, however we want to look at that, and then we will have eternity. So this is the easiest and the most simple of the models. We have this church age that includes the millennium, the tribulation. We're going to have troubles for a long period of time. Have we had troubles since the time of Christ till now? Right? Yeah. So we can see that we could have tribulation this time. And then at some point, Jesus is going to return, the rapture of those believers who are alive, the resurrection of the believers from the dead, and we're going to be in eternity with heaven. Those are left, and we'll have a judgment of the word of the living and the dead, and then we will spend eternity with Jesus or not. Okay? So this is amillennialism. This is probably the simplest explanation of the end times, the easiest one to kind of grasp. The least moving parts are really is 1, 2, 3, 4 parts to it in this one. And many from time of St. Augustine and others have really thought this is probably one of the oldest ones, or maybe the second oldest one. This is the easiest one to do, amillennialism. Okay, so we're going to change it up a little bit. The next one we're going to talk about is post-millennialism, okay? Post-millennialism, and the reason we call it post is that the return of Christ is going to come after the millennium, okay? So we still have this church age that's happening here, but we're going to have Cassie and Vicky switch spots. So we're going to have this church age that's happening from the beginning of Jesus' reign, and the tribulation is going to happen, okay? And you guys just take a step to the left, one step or to your right, sorry. But at some point, we're going to have this period of the millennium. It's not necessarily a literal 1,000 years, but a period where we're going to have great success in sharing the good news and the gospel, and it's really going to kind of like crescendo all the way until the return of Christ. Okay? So it's going to be this time of peace and prosperity and the gospel excelling over the world. And then we're going to have the return of Christ come and the rapture and the resurrection of the dead all happening together. So we have church age tribulation, a period of really great peace, this return and rapture of Christ, and the resurrection of the dead, and then also the judgment is going to happen at that same time. The return of Christ, the rapture of those believers going up, the resurrection of those believers who have died are coming back to life and spending eternity with Christ, and then the judgment of the world, and then your eternal position. So this is called post-millennialism because the return of Christ happens post the millennial. Does that make sense? Okay, post-millennialism. This is another well-accepted theory by many, many, many dedicated and mainline theologians. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, so that's postmillennialism. Now, this next one is the oldest theory, the oldest model. It's called classic premillennialism. Can you guess why it's called premillennialism? The return of Christ comes before the millennium. Good job, good job. So we still have this church age. We still have this tribulation that's happening, this long, great tribulation, not because of necessarily the intensity of the troubles, but the length of the troubles, okay? And then we're going to have the return of Christ. So Vicky's going to have to move down a little bit. So we're going to have the rapture and the return of Christ. And so Val's going to come down over here too. So you and Larry hang together. So we have this return of Christ, this rapture that's going to happen. And then we have this reign of Christ where Jesus is reigning on earth, this millennium where Christ is reigning on earth, okay? Following that, oops. We're gonna switch Katie too, sorry. You guys are all staying together most of the time. So the resurrection, the rapture, then this peaceful time of millennium, and the judgment will come after that millennium. Jim, you're doing a great job there. You're anchoring the whole side. It's really good. Karen is very proud of you. You're doing a great job, okay? So this is pre-millennium. This is classic millennium. This is the oldest model, the oldest theory, and it's pre-millennialism because the return of Christ happens before the millennium, okay? So we've had amillennialism, we've had post-millennialism, and now we have pre-millennialism, okay? This next one is the most complex, okay? And this next one also happened, it's the youngest of the theories. This didn't come around until 1830. And in the 1830s, there was this young woman, 15-year-old Margaret MacDonald, and Margaret had a vision, and she had a dream of Christ coming back 2 more times, a double return of Christ. And this pastor, John Darby from England, got a hold of this. This was kind of during the French Revolution, and all the violence was happening there in France, and the fear that people in England had. And John Darby developed this idea from Margaret MacDonald into a theory that is called, get this is a good one, okay? Dispensational pre-tribulation premillennialism, okay? Dispensationalism is a denominational kind of construct of the whole of the story of Christ, okay? You hear people from Dallas Theological Seminary are dispensationalists. D.L. Moody, Chuck Swindoll, if you hear Chuck Swindoll on the radio, they're dispensationalists. The Left Behind books, that is all based on dispensational teaching, okay? And but what's going to happen here is we're going to have this church age, okay? Now I'm going to have to break you guys up a little bit, okay? So then we're going to have this church age, and then Val is going to come down, and at the end of the church age, she's going to come right in here between Sherry and Cassie. At the end of this church age, we're going to have a rapture, and some even would call it a secret rapture. I don't know how that would be secret if all of a sudden believers just started disappearing, but there's a rapture, and then we have this tribulation. And they believe it's a literal 7-year tribulation. You're going to find in this dispensational model, this pre-millennialist, pre-tribulation model, that it's very literal translation, okay? So we have a literal 7 years of tribulation, and then the return of Christ is going to come, and then, Vicky, we're going to have you come over here. We're going to have this millennium, in a literal millennium of 1,000 years where Christ will reign on earth, okay? But we don't have any We don't have any of the believers, right? Because the believers have been sent up, correct? Right? And then, Katie, I forgot about Katie. Katie needs to come down here with Val. Sorry. I'm sorry. See, there's so many parts to this. It's very confusing, okay? So church age, the rapture comes, the resurrection of the dead come, 7 literal years of tribulation. So instead of this great long tribulation, the great tribulation is said to be great because it's intense, the intensity of the troubles. Then we have this return of Christ who comes down to reign on earth for a literal 1,000 years, a literal millennium. And then we have the judgment of the world and our friend Jim with our eternal placements, okay? Is this as clear as mud now? Can you see how dispensational pre-tribulation, premillennialism is a little bit more confusing than some of the other models? This is pre-millennial because the return of Christ is before the millennium, okay? And it's pre-tribulation because the rapture happens before the tribulation, okay? So we have dispensational, pre-tribulation, premillennialism, all right? So those are the 4 main models: amillennialism, postmillennialism, premillennialism, and then dispensational, pre-tribulation, premillennialism. All right. Thank you, guys. Let's give my hand. I'll just take all those from you very much. Thank you so much. Is everybody ready for their quiz? I have to get ready. I got to get ready for my class I'm going to be teaching here. So you can stay up. You get to finish if you're going to stay up here, though. Okay. Thank you, guys. So amillennialism, that very more simple outline of what's going to happen, and then post-millennialism, classic premillennialism, and then the more confusing, more complex dispensational pre-tribulation, premillennialism. These theories have been debated for years, and if I was to share with you, my probably bent is toward amillennialism. It's the simplest model. It's the easiest one to understand. And I think it's really the most biblical from a serious study of the Bible. Because we're not literalists of the Bible, right? We read the Bible seriously, but don't necessarily take everything literally. Whereas that last model, the dispensational model, is a very literal reading of the text. So meaning 7 years, meaning 1,000 years, and very literal. But as we said, many have theorized and debated this for years and years and years. And, and we're trying to get our human minds to be able to get around this idea, which is confusing, right? And get around this very divine, esoteric idea. And often when we try to kind of put labels on and put God in a box, it doesn't really work too well, So I have a feeling when we get up there, and there's other theories, but these are the main 4, but when we get up there with these models and theories, and Jesus is like, again, you guys made this really way too difficult, But if I was to get with one, I would say, amillennialism is probably where I would be in that camp. It doesn't, I could be wrong. I probably could get behind any of the first 3. The last one I have a little struggle with the interpretation there. But we won't know till we meet Jesus face to face. In Matthew 24, if we continue reading beyond where Cody read today, it says, nobody knows the time or the place or how it's going to happen. Only the Father knows this. Often attention to the second coming can get pretty speculative. And we tend to not be speculative people in the United Methodist Church. As descendants of John Wesley, who did also have a prediction of the end times as well, of a time that didn't happen, obviously. But as spiritual descendants of John Wesley, we are usually practical people attending to Christ and focusing on Christ. We're dealing on the practicalness of our faith. as God is present with us in worship and in our daily life and in serving the needs of those around us in our community. So talk of rapture or a great tribulation visited upon those not raptured is not really found in our doctrinal standards. It's something that us as United Methodists, we don't really focus on too much. We don't have a doctrine that says all United Methodists should believe this model. It doesn't happen for us. These are products of speculation and of later generations, especially the dispensational model came even after John Wesley's death, so he had no idea that this was even developed. And so it's not part of our regular teaching as United Methodists. Our focus, though, is less on the second coming of Christ and more on living the teachings of Jesus' first coming. The things that we saw in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. Healing and feeding, taking care of the poor and the widows and the orphans. Bringing people to meet Jesus. This is where our focus is, on living out the teachings of Jesus. And generally speaking, United Methodists are focused on welcoming His saving grace into our lives. It's in the here and now of our lives. We focus on the prevenient grace that God is with us even before we know who God is, that moves in us, kind of inching us and needling us, encouraging us to look toward Christ. And then justifying grace is that stake in the ground moment, that time when righteousness is worked in us by Jesus so that we can trust Jesus for salvation. And then after that point, Jesus works in us through sanctifying grace that perfects us in our life. Doesn't make us perfect by not doing any wrong, but makes us perfect in love to our neighbor. Perfect in our love of intention. So rather than focusing on the second coming of Christ, we focus on loving as Christ loved now. And for United Methodists, it's far less about the way off future and predicting the future, and far more about living out the gospel of God's love and bringing people to an experience of God's love that transforms their lives. It transforms their lives and drives them out into their communities to share this love with others. And it's this world we live in that it's God's kingdom, not quite yet, but it's here somewhat already. So I think talking about and focusing too much on end times can sometimes breed a spirit of fear and overwhelm, right? I mean, many of these models, speak of, especially of the dispensational models, speak of this great tribulation and this fear. I kind of almost even some fear mongering of trying to encourage people to come to a belief in Jesus. But I've rarely known very few people that are argued into faith, or very few people that are brought to faith by fear. I think there's much more productivity in people being brought to faith by love and hope rather than a spirit of fear. But these models, sometimes just focusing on the end times, can bring fear and overwhelm. But we're not people of fear. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but a spirit of power and love and self-discipline." Because we are not people of fear, we're people of hope. Hope because we know the end is not the end. There's hope because even though there is physical death here on earth, we have been promised eternal life with Christ. There's hope because one day, all of creation will experience redemption and renewal and resurrection. Not just us, but all of creation. Someday, my dogs will experience resurrection and redemption and stop eating my books and my papers. Yeah, right. All of creation will experience this redemption and renewal and resurrection. And friends, it's because of this hope that we are commissioned and commanded by God to live a life worthy of God. We follow the example of Christ. Paul tells us in Ephesians 4 that we are to live as people worthy of the call that we have received from God. We are to conduct ourselves with all humility and gentleness and patience. Can you imagine a world if we conducted ourselves with humility and gentleness and patience? Right? I mean, we could just make a big difference if we just said political campaigns had to be humility and gentleness and patience, right? On all sides. But we're to conduct ourselves with humility, gentleness, and patience, and accept each other with love. Paul goes on to say that we're to make an effort to preserve the unity of the Spirit with the peace that ties us all together. So rather than focusing on the fear and the overwhelm of what might be and how is this going to be, I think we can just focus on the love of Christ. And in all of these difficult, sometimes to understanding bumper stickers that we've talked about, right? I think these phrases can be avoided if we simply live a life by the example of Jesus. Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection, his teachings, the apostles and other disciples who came later show us this way to live. Paul gives us great instructions of humility and gentleness and patience and unity and love. So if we just focused instead on some of these bumper stickers and the theology behind that, and focus rather on the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, not worrying about when and how and who is going to be involved in these end times, but just love God and love our neighbor. And for us at Clearview, right, this is our mission. We've said that we are living an embodied faith. We're living a faith that is a part of every inch of us. It's all through our arteries and our veins and our capillaries and all these other parts that I didn't pay attention to in biology class. You know, it's all of who we are. It's not just about this space. It's not just about us being believers and loving God and our neighbor here and then going doing whatever we want to do in the world. But it's living this embodied faith, sharing God's love for all. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're opening our home tonight to show this embodied faith. Not that we have it all figured out. More appropriately, that we probably know better than many that we don't have it all figured out, right? It's okay to be a hypocrite if you know you're a hypocrite, right? It's when we don't have the self-awareness to know that, yeah, we're trying to follow after this Jesus guy, but we know we're falling short. It's okay to do our best with that, but it's when we aren't aware that we're falling short. But we just live this faith, this part of us, and we love God and we love our neighbor. And that really, and we let the rest of it work itself out. Because there's a lot of work to do here and now in this community without worrying about